I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Well, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, I'm walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. I'm walking and talking with my mind stayed on. I'm walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Let me tell you, I'm singing and praying with my mind stayed on freedom. Singing and praying with my mind stayed on freedom. Well, I'm singing and praying with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Don't you know it ain't no harm to keep my mind stayed on freedom. Yeah, there ain't no harm to keep my mind stayed on freedom. I said there ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. I woke up this morning dead. I woke up with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah,
We are so thankful to Anthony McGill, who is the principal clarinetist at the New York City Philharmonic, for giving us permission to use that song that we just heard in our service today. Today, this being 4th of July weekend, I want to talk about what many are calling the new birth of freedom here in the United States and what it means, the impact that it's had on me, and as a straight, white, cisgendered male. This is an interesting time for people like me, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the struggles. I want to be a little vulnerable about that in the message today, and I want to just talk about how we got here and how it seems that every 100 years or so in our country we've had to begin to fight in a new way for freedom, particularly as it relates to black people. So, here we are at a moment where statues are being torn down by crowds in the streets all across America. What a time. Who would have imagined that we'd be living through a moment like this? I remember statues being torn down, watching Saddam Hussein's statues being torn down in Iraq after he was toppled. And it's interesting to have this happening in our country. And I think it's really important. And it's important that we have a sense, other than what we hear on the news and from late night comedians, about what's happening. And so I'm glad we're able to talk about it here in church, in our religious community, in our faith community, through the lens of our values and theology. So think about it. 1776, July 4th, we have our birth of freedom from England. Fast forward 100 years, and in the 1860s, we have emancipation and the Civil War and the end of the Civil War. And then in the 1960s, fast forward another 100 years, and we have the Civil Rights Movement. So it seems like every century since this country's been founded, there's been a push for more freedom, particularly as it relates to black people, because the original compromise, some people call the original sin of America, was with slavery. And we've been trying to take care of this unfinished business ever since. And so here we are in 2020, and it's happening right on the streets. Young people, people of all ages, people of all ethnicities and races, coming out and saying, it's time. We need to do this thing now. We need to get this right. I think I heard William Barber, Dr. William Barber, speaking about this at the National Cathedral the other day, and he said, when we heard George Floyd wailing out and saying, I can't breathe, it was as if there was a collective gasp across our entire democracy. And a lot of other people said, yeah, I can't breathe either. The time has come for a new birth of freedom. Let's get this right. Let's do our best in our lifetimes to finish this unfinished business as it relates to black people and the African experience in America. Because there's no other people that, I know we lump all the groups together and we talk about people of color and we talk about marginalized people, and that's all really important, and there's connections to all of forms of oppression. But there's a very unique experience that Africans have had in America, as particularly the 9 out of 10 who didn't immigrate here. The only people who did not immigrate here, but came here, were forced here, were dragged here under atrocious conditions, and were ripped of their religion and their culture and their sense of place and family and all the rest of it, and then demeaned and denounced and lots of violence and owned. And so with that experience that no other people have had, there's been a post that's been going around on social media that sort of describes how we got here very succinctly. I want to share that with you. I couldn't find attribution. People just keep cutting it and pasting it, but there's no attribution. I've edited it a little bit, but let me read it to you. It says, 400 years ago, white people brought black people to this country and enslaved them and sold them and treated them as less than human for 250 years. During that time, white men created laws and systems of government and built organizations of all kinds to serve the interests of white people, and particularly white men. All the while, 10 to 15 generations of white families got to grow and flourish and make choices that could better their lives. And then, 150 years ago, after a bloody war, and with the help of 200,000 former African slaves, slavery was abolished. But then, angry and upset white people created laws that made it impossible for black people to vote, to own land, and to have the same rights as white people. And these white folks even erected monuments to glorify people who actively fought to try to keep them enslaved. All the while, 5 to 10 more generations of white families got to grow and accumulate wealth and gain land and get education. In an economy that was supercharged from the beginning due to generations of free labor of black people who were never compensated. The greatest economy that the world has ever seen. And then, just 60 years ago, in this 400-year history, after a lot of protest and struggle led by black people, Americans made it legal finally for black people to vote and began to take down a number of the forms of legal discrimination against black people. But once again, upset and angry white people fought against it to keep schools segregated, to close neighborhoods to white people only, and to make it harder for black people to get bank loans, to get a quality education or health care, or even to marry a white person. All the while, 2 to 3 more generations of white families got to grow and pass on their wealth to their children and their children's children. And then, just recently, we entered an age where we have the technology now to make public the things that were already happening in private. The beatings, the stop and frisk laws, the unequal distribution of justice, the police brutality. And let's remember that the police in this country were created as slave patrols. They were created specifically for the job of finding, catching runaway slaves and maintaining the slave economy. And for most of the last 4 centuries, the police had as a key part of their job description to enforce laws that were designed to deny black people equal rights. That was their job. Jane and Jim Crow laws were created with the intention of keeping black people in a subordinated position in society. The police were trained to maintain laws and order designed by and for white people, specifically with the idea of keeping black people marginalized and down. And only now, after 400 plus years and 20 plus generations of white people having a head start, are we starting to truly have a dialogue about what it means to be black in America, to have lived through that history, and to be living through how it is manifest today. White people don't like to talk about it, but the structures and the institutions throughout our nation have been created by and for white people, and they don't work as well for other people. And that's why we need this new birth of freedom that we're going through right now. Now, it does not mean that white people have all had equal access and have never experienced discrimination, have had equal opportunity. And it doesn't mean that people with multiple identities do not also have disadvantages that they face. It does not deny that the ways that this system impacts other communities of color, but what it does mean is that we owe it to our black neighbors and to ourselves and to our nation and to our world to acknowledge the things that we often don't talk about and don't want to talk about, specifically regarding the black experience in America, because discussing it is the first step, the necessary step for us to move towards a more equitable country. And so, with that in mind, I want us to talk today about critical consciousness. This is a term that was coined by a theologian and educator from Brazil named Paulo Freire. And he had this idea of critical consciousness, saying that there's the superficial knowledge, there's the story that gets told by a culture, by history, by these different ways that we absorb our culture, even without words, all these ways that we learn things, and we have to get critical and go deeper, find ways to uncover the covert stories, the hidden stories, the other stories that often are displaced in order to maintain a specific status quo, which, as we know in America, has been a status quo that has been filled with inequality and violence and racial injustice in all these ways. It's been a culture that is filled with death. And so how do we get beneath it? And so he came up with this concept that he called, it's a sort of translated from Brazilian, but conscientization, which is action and reflection, so that it's different from consciousness raising, because consciousness raising often has the idea of learning about things that have already been discovered and have been passed down. But conscientization is about discovering for ourselves for a first time, maybe revealing and uncovering things that we couldn't learn from what's been passed down. And so it requires direct experience. And part of it, it talks about using arts and theater, and particularly the arts and theater of marginalized communities and communities who come from perspectives and voices and experiences that are unlike those of the majority culture. And then there's the action, the experiences that we get in this process, and then the reflection. And when he talks about reflection, he means specifically reflection with people who have different experiences, people who are different from yourself, who look at things and see things differently. That's how we begin to uncover the revealed and the covered over parts of the story that are so important for us to move into a more just and more free society. That's one of the reasons why All Souls is partnering this year with World Stage Theater and Kelly McLeod Shingen. That theater here in Tulsa, it was created with this concept of bringing these voices to our community and lifting them up through theater. And they often have, after their shows, they invite the cast and the people, usually a very diverse group of people who are there, into dialogue about what we've just experienced and why they brought it and how people are experiencing it. So it's really beautiful. And All Souls is based on this idea of critical consciousness, of helping our young people, raising our young people, not indoctrinating them into the way things have always been in religion or otherwise, but teaching them to think critically and to understand what's out there and to hopefully have experiences that help them to be able to critique it and shape it in new ways. Our theme this whole month, is shaping change. One of the ways we shape change is by having this critical consciousness. I'll give you an example from my own experience. When I think about how I learned about the Civil War, I learned about it. It was a story of how good white people from the North saved the poor, powerless, servile African slaves. And only more recently, after digging more deeply into the story, have I discovered that there were 200,000 former slaves who fought in battalions that won critical and decisive battles that allowed the Union to win the war, that saved the Union, if you will. So I understood when Al Sharpton said at the Juneteenth celebration here in Tulsa this year, when he said, it wasn't that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, it was that the slaves freed Abraham Lincoln. I understand what he means, that once again, Black people in America who helped save the Union, preserve the Union, allow us to have the country and the life that we have, but the story doesn't get told that way. That gets left out, just like the piece about having created the greatest economy the world's ever seen was built on the backs, literally, on the backs of 250 years of people's labor that they were not paid for. And so we need to look critically at this history in a way that helps us to see it differently. I was raised with this old story. And so even as I begin to learn these new stories, it takes me time. It's like a head shake sometimes. Like, oh, okay, I see. And that's what's happening with a lot of these statues and the names of schools and other things where we're learning the history and we go, wow, it's a lot more complex than I ever thought it was. And it can, first, we can be reactive to it. I know I've found myself being reactive to different things that I've been learning and different things people are saying and different perspectives people have about the Mayflower or Christopher Columbus or all kinds of characters in the history of this country. I wanted to take a second before I close to just talk a little bit about, just a little more about what that's been like for me as a straight, white, cisgendered, able-bodied male with a degree from Harvard University, nonetheless, to be going through a moment like this when structures are changing and attitudes are changing and we're beginning to do things differently. I mean, for me, having that social location that I've had has meant that all my life I have seen examples of people who look like me in leadership, in government, in business, on television, you name it. I've always seen people who look like me in charge, leading, speaking, being the ones coming up with ideas, being valued. And so without even words, I just absorbed that kind of understanding of what it means to be someone like me in the world. And So in a moment like this where that's starting to change, I'm having to reorient myself, and sometimes that can be difficult. I mean, I'm the police. I usually feel comfortable around the police. I always feel welcome and treated well when I go to a hospital or a doctor's office or a store or into a job interview or any of these things. And so it's for me to learn how other people experience a lot of those things has been news. And then to experience some of the new structures that we're creating in our faith tradition at Unitarian Universalist and in other progressive parts of this country and community, where we're starting to say we want to hear from different voices. So we don't hear all from male voices. We say, sometimes we create structures where we say we want to hear a male voice and then a female voice. Or want to hear a person of color's voice and then a white person's voice, or we sort of trying to create new structures. Are they perfect? No. Do they always work the way we want them to? No. But what we're trying to do is create opportunities to hear from voices that we often don't hear, and perspectives, because we know we need to hear them. We need to learn from them, that we can't create and recreate this culture without those kinds of voices and perspectives that mean so much and have so much wisdom to them. But what does that mean for me? It's meant that sometimes I'll come into a situation where before I'd be handed the microphone, asked to speak, feel really good about something that I have to say, and then realize folks don't want to hear another white male perspective or someone from my social location. We actually want to hear from some LGBT folks and some women and some people of color and some other folks, immigrants, folks without documentation or what have you, because we need to try to find out these kinds of things. And so it's incredible what kind of knowledge and what kind of learning is happening. And what Paulo Freire would say is it's allowing us to live into our full humanity. Because he explains how oppression of any kind, it distorts both the people who've created the system that is stealing some people's humanity, and it distorts the humanity of those who are doing the stealing or on the other side of it. And so all of our humanity are being distorted by the way this is happening. And the promise of this moment is that we can live into the fullness of our humanity, our freedom, the ideals of this nation that have been put forth for us to live into. That sometimes we've enjoyed, some of us have enjoyed pretending like we've already arrived at those things, but it's a real wake-up call for many to realize we haven't. That when George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," a lot of other people in this country said, "I can't breathe either." And for those of us who have been breathing okay in this culture to realize, all right, there's a lot of people who are saying they can't breathe, and we need to help people breathe, because we know when you give birth, especially through the birthing pains, and we're going through some pains right now, and we're going to go through more, we need to breathe. We need to breathe, and we need to breathe together. And I just want to say to my white male counterparts who are listening, we'll do this together. People need us to do this together. We need to do this together for our own well-being and the fullness of our own humanity. It's not about the success in life is not about accumulating more things. It's about living into the fullness of our humanity and our possibility. And we'll do it together, and we'll do it, and we'll be a part of it. Sometimes that means stepping back and saying less or doing less or following the leadership of others. Will they be perfect? Will the new leaders get it right all the time? No. Will the structures and systems that get put into place and are experimented with, will they all work? No. But I know I've been leading a church for 20 years, and all the things I've tried and all the leadership I've offered hasn't been perfect either. So we have to have a lot of grace and mercy for these new leaders who are passionately coming forward and helping us all to live into the dream and the beauty and the possibilities of America, and the dream and the beauty and the possibilities of our own souls. This is a time of a new birth in this country, and it's quite a path that we're on, and we're on it together, and this is a great moment to be alive. Scary and anxiety-provoking for many of us, and painful also in many ways, but also exciting, as birth is exciting. Birth is all those things. So let us breathe, let us hold each other's hands, and let us do this together on this 4th of July weekend and until the dream comes true. I love you and I miss you. Amen.